Greetings, comrades, and I recently had this idea that I thought could make a fun little video. And that idea was, what if each of the four elements from the Avatar series were represented by one of the four quadrants of the political compass? Which one would they be? So let's start with the political tribe I affiliate with, which is the Libertarian Left. And I think the Libertarian Left is an easy one. We represent the airbenders, the element of air, light-footed and free-thinking. We dance between concepts easier and quicker than anybody else on the political spectrum, capable of entertaining and rejecting ideas fairly quickly. We're also the ideological faction that can play the best with others. We're a very peace-loving political movement. At our core, we really want everybody to get along and respect each other's differences, but many of us kind of understand that that's not exactly the reality that we live in. We're able to quickly move in between ideas, and that makes some people think that we don't really have ideological boundaries or structures. That's definitely not the case. Our structures are very defined, and if you tread on them, you will receive extreme pushback. Our free thinking nature also makes some believe that we are weak because we are unwilling to push our ideas on others. We're not a very proselytizing political faction. This, however, is a very grave mistake. During argumentation, our strategy is essentially to quickly shift in between arguments to keep our opponents off guard. Very rarely do we stay the course with one argument unless this happens to be working exceptionally well, quickly moving in and out of concepts and striking where we believe the weakest point is. Also, we have the advantage of really being able to take arguments from any side of the political spectrum and use them to our advantage, especially if we see an argument or weakness that we can exploit. Our biggest weaknesses is that our free thinking nature makes it very difficult for us all to get on the same page together and push for our ideological goals. It's very much like herding cats, theoretically possible, but I don't know anybody who can do it well consistently. And at the end of the day, I would say that the ideological faction we get along with the least is the authoritarian right, but sometimes we in the authoritarian left don't see eye to eye because we have different ways in which we want to get our similar political goals accomplished. Speaking of the authoritarian left, they are the next faction on the list. And which element do they represent? I believe the authoritarian left represents the element of earth and the earthbenders. Firmly rooted in their ideology, they believe that their ideas are so pure and morally correct that they simply need to smash their opponents again and again with them until they break underneath the moral weight of their arguments. They definitely do not like deviation from the ideological foundation, if you will. Uh, they believe that the ideological foundation is the framework for all their arguments, that essentially you cannot exist without it. And this is one of the things that can cause the authoritarian left and the libertarian left not to see eye to eye on various issues. They are much more comfortable with proselytizing their viewpoints. In fact, they believe that they have a moral obligation to do so. And their loyalty to their ideological foundation makes it much easier for them to organize around their political values. Their argumentation strategy is to take a list of very strong, very well distilled arguments and essentially beat their opponents over the face with them over and over and over again until they crumble underneath the pure will and weight of their arguments. They will take one angle of attack and just smash, 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 smash till they break through. And this is obviously it's a powerful strategy, but it makes them flexible because if an opponent can counter their arguments, it means that essentially they have nothing to fall back on and they can find themselves in serious trouble. Additionally, their inflexibility makes it so they can't move from their ideological framework very well. So they must absorb the full force of every blow against them. And normally they're prepared for this because without it, they would essentially crumble underneath the weight, but their strong structural framework makes it so they can take these arguments, but eventually you can bash them over to the point where they can crumble. They cannot evade, they have to tank every hit. Their most hated faction, obviously, is the authoritarian right. I don't think that there's any question about that. And that brings us to the authoritarian right. And I think the authoritarian right was another easy one. The authoritarian right represents the element of fire, firebenders, and the Fire Nation. They end up being completely devoted to whatever autocratic figure they can shoe in as the Fire Lord. They use their devoted fervor essentially to transform themselves into the willing instrument and will gladly fight on behalf of the Fire Lord under virtually any circumstances. Their tenacious devotion to their leader makes it extremely difficult to change their mind, and they end up being the most loyal to their ideology, generally speaking. You could present them completely undeniable evidence that their leader is in the wrong, and they would never believe you, essentially. Any deviation from the will of the leader will not be tolerated under any circumstances. This is different from the way the authoritarian left sees it, as their devotion is to an ideological foundation, not a one figure or cult of personality necessarily. Essentially, if you're not with the Fire Lord, you're against them, and they usually only want small tokens of submission to the Fire Lord in comparison to the authoritarian left that can usually want much more ideological buy-in. That being said, there will be absolutely no negativity or second guessing of the Fire Lord. That will absolutely not be tolerated. During argumentation, they prefer forceful and inflammatory rhetoric, which they use to dehumanize and tear down their opponents on a fundamental core level. Insults, scorn, and other dehumanizing language are all fair game for the authoritarian right, as their ultimate goal is to wear someone down to the point where they can justify using their most vile language against them. The major weakness for the authoritarian right being that they don't play well with others under the best of circumstances. The only ones who can remotely stand them are the libertarian right. And I think that they just merely tolerate them at best. In fact, I think they kind of pay homage to them just because they don't want to get sucked into their raging inferno. And whenever these guys look like they might rise to power, the libertarian left and the authoritarian left are going to work together under any circumstances and fight them bitterly tooth and nail to prevent them from gaining any ground. Their most hated faction is the libertarian left, as it represents the biggest anathema to their political ideology. And that brings us to our last faction, our last cohort, and through the process of elimination, I'm sure you could figure out the last element. They, of course, represent the element of water. And these guys were probably the most difficult to classify. I think that they represent actually the most unique of all the political tribes. But for them, just like the water tribes, they elevate one single thing above all else, and that is the flow of capital. There is nothing which they believe should impede the flow of capital, and the more capital there is flowing out into the world, the better off they believe everybody will be. Essentially, they believe that, like water, capital is the life force of society. Ultimately, though, they act only in service of the river of capital. They are not very concerned with what other people are doing. In fact, they encourage others to forge their own paths in life, as they couldn't care less what they do, just so long as they don't intend to mess with the flow of capital. Just so long as they don't intend to mess with that flow of the river, you're good. Because if you try and mess with their precious flow of capital, oh man, they are coming at you hot and heavy. Because for them, it's almost like a spiritual connection to the flow of capital. They believe that no matter what, essentially, the more capital is flowing around, the better off things will be. Doesn't matter if that capital has destroyed a bunch of people's houses, flooded some farmland, destroyed some industrial sectors, it'll all turn out okay. So, generally speaking, like the water tribes, they are unconcerned with what's happening in the greater world. Essentially, to them, the greater world is merely trading partners and business associates. They can get along with other factions just so long as they don't mess with their precious flow. Other factions can find them kind of weird for their overemphasis and almost obsession with capital. Their argumentation strategy is essentially to bring everything back around to the importance of water or capital as the metaphor that we're using. Essentially, all arguments flow around all other issues and all come back to that importance of capital, the lifeblood of society as they see it. All this other ideological mumbo jumbo doesn't mean crap to them at the end of the day. No matter what, they will always find a way to bring it back to reminding you how important capital is and how important it is that it should flow unimpeded. When it comes to their weakness, it's essentially that they only really care about one thing, and that is the flow of capital. They aren't going to come together and rally around anything else, just so long as it is not interfering with their main priority. It's very difficult to get them to rally around or even care about anything else. They may fall in line with the authoritarian right, but I think that ultimately their support is tepid at best. Their most hated faction is obviously the authoritarian left, as they have the most extreme ideas for interrupting and redistributing that flow of the river, that river of capital, if you will. And that's all I got. I just thought that this would be a fun little video to do. And now that I've got this studio set up, I can just jump in here and spend a half an hour or so talking about something like this and bringing it to you guys. So I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, this has been the Comrade signing off for now. And you guys take care.